Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
At my own engagement dinner, right as the champagne hit the table and the waiter finished pouring the last drop into my future mother-in-law's glass, my father raised his voice in that way he always did, like everything he said was meant to be broadcast through a megaphone wrapped in smugness, and said, "Well, we're just glad you found someone who'll tolerate you." The words came out so smooth, almost like a joke, and a couple of guests even chuckled awkwardly, as if unsure whether they were supposed to laugh or cringe. My fiancé, Eric, froze, his hand still holding my chair as he waited for me to sit. My cousin Jen dropped her fork. You know those moments when the world doesn't stop, but your brain does? Everything around me kept going. The clink of silverware, someone taking a sip of water, the soft hum of music in the background. But I just stood there, like my entire body was locked behind the bars of a memory I didn't choose to revisit. I didn't sit. I didn't say thank you. I didn't laugh it off like I used to when I was 13 or 21 or even 30. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a small velvet box, deep burgundy, soft, and worn just slightly at the corners, and walked over to the long dinner table where my father sat flanked by two of his golf buddies. I set the box down in front of him, gently, like it weighed nothing and everything all at once. I looked him dead in the eye, and with a half smile I didn't feel, said, "Funny, because this was for you. But now?" And I didn't say another word. The silence that followed could have swallowed the entire room. Now I know what you're thinking. What the hell was in that box? A ring, a watch, a letter? And more importantly, what kind of father says something like that to his daughter on one of the most important nights of her life? But here's the thing. This wasn't new, not even close. This was just the first time I didn't pretend it didn't bother me. The truth is, this dinner, the candles, the hand-picked wines, the 7-course menu, even the damn string quartet I thought would add some warmth, wasn't for celebration. It was a test, a final test. And that box, it wasn't just a gift. It was leverage. It was a question, disguised as kindness, wrapped in velvet and 37 years of silence. You ever have someone in your life who talks to you like you're a stray dog they almost adopted once, but decided not to because you barked too loud? That was my father. My whole life, he called it raising me right. But it felt more like raising me out of spite. Every birthday was a roast. Every compliment came with a backhand. Every "I'm proud of you" was drowned in a "but you could have done better." I was the high achiever he never rooted for, the daughter he introduced by listing my flaws before my accomplishments. "This is Rachel. She's always been a little intense," he'd say, as if intensity was a disease he forgot to vaccinate me for. I never planned on inviting him to the engagement dinner. Hell, I didn't even tell him I was engaged until a week after Eric proposed. But there was a part of me, that weak, naive, still somehow hopeful part, that thought maybe, just maybe, if I extended an olive branch, he might finally drop the act. Maybe he'd look at Eric and see that I hadn't driven another one away. Maybe he'd say something normal, something almost loving, and we could finally move past whatever invisible grudge he's been holding since the day I was born. So I planned the dinner, picked the restaurant, and even sat him at the head of the table because some twisted part of me still wanted his approval. That box I gave him? It had been sitting in my purse for 3 days. I kept it close, like a secret that needed to be released at the right time. Inside was something small, but not meaningless. A gold money clip, custom engraved. It said, "For everything you gave, for everything I couldn't say." It was supposed to be a truce, a thank you he didn't earn, but I wanted to give anyway. Because even when someone fails you repeatedly, some part of you still aches to forgive them. Not for them, but so you can stop bleeding from the same wound over and over again. But when he said that line, "We're just glad you found someone who'll tolerate you," it wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. It was a reminder. You don't get to feel proud. You don't get to be happy without earning it through my approval. And that's when I knew I'd been giving him power he didn't deserve. Again. I didn't stay for dessert. I whispered something to Eric. Something like, "I'll explain everything later." and walked out with my dignity intact, if not a little shaken. I didn't look back to see if my father opened the box. I didn't care if he threw it away or tucked it into his coat like a trophy. What mattered was that he knew he'd been given something valuable, and that I'd taken it back without taking a thing. And here's the part where I want to ask you, maybe not out loud, but in that way we all wonder when we see a family implode quietly over appetizers. If someone in your life had one last chance to redeem themselves, and they blew it, would you forgive them anyway? Or would you finally, just once, let them see what it feels like to lose something they never realized they had? Because this box wasn't just a gift, it was a test, and he just failed it. There's a cruel kind of silence that lives in some families. Not the peaceful kind, not the respectful kind, but the type that suffocates you slowly, like invisible hands wrapped around your throat. And growing up, that silence filled every room in our house. It wasn't loud fights or shattered dishes that shaped me, not dramatic walkouts or tears soaked into throw pillows, but the quiet disapproval, the offhand comments dressed as concern, the long pauses before my father said something that would sink into my ribs and stay there for years. He never yelled. He didn't have to. His favorite weapon was disappointment, wielded so subtly that I used to wonder if I was the only one who noticed. If maybe I was just sensitive, dramatic, too much, like he said when I cried after he told me no one would marry a girl with opinions that loud. My mother, on the other hand, had this soft presence, like a lamp that never turned on fully, just a low glow that flickered in the corners. She wasn't cold, not exactly, and she didn't hate me. If anything, she seemed to be watching the same slow train crash I was living in, helpless to stop it, but trying to soften the impact with a look or a touch or a quiet, "Let it go, honey," whispered from the kitchen doorway. I never knew what kept her silent. Why she didn't push back more. Why she let him run the narrative of who I was like some cruel screenwriter refusing to let the main character speak. But as I got older, I started to understand that survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like endurance, like learning to breathe in shallow bursts just to avoid suffocating completely. When I was 29, 3 months before her cancer took everything from her, we sat on the porch one evening, wrapped in itchy blankets, both of us pretending the air wasn't already turning too cold. She looked out across the lawn, eyes unfocused, like she was watching something that hadn't happened yet. And she said something I didn't understand at the time, but would replay in my head 1,000 times after her funeral. She said, "Sometimes the best thing a woman can do is leave behind something better than herself." I thought she meant memories, or maybe some final words, a recipe, a scent, something poetic. But what she really meant, and what I wouldn't discover until much later, was truth. She meant a roadmap, a confession, a set of keys to unlock the things she never got to say while she was alive. For a long time, I believed she left me nothing. My father never gave me anything of hers. After she died, no jewelry, no letters, not even the cardigan she wore every evening when her bones started to hurt. He said she wouldn't want to be remembered like that, which, of course, was a lie dressed in grief. I believed him, as I always did, because believing him was easier than confronting the fact that my mother might have left things behind and that he'd taken them, hidden them, burned them, or worse, kept them like trophies of a war he thought he'd won. But last year, on a random Tuesday in late October, I went back to the old house while he was out of town for a golf tournament in Arizona. He still lived there, alone, bitter, surrounded by silence and old photos he never dusted. I had a key he didn't know still worked, tucked behind the false panel in the mailbox where I used to hide my diary. When I was 13, I told myself I just wanted to look, to see if anything of hers was still there, some trace of who she really was outside of being his wife and my ghost of a mother. And what I found wasn't much at first. A few dusty albums, a bottle of perfume so old it smelled like vinegar, a half-written grocery list tucked into a drawer. But then I opened the back of her closet and saw the floorboard, the one that creaked in a way none of the others did, the one she used to step around like it mattered. I pried it up with a butter knife, sweating from adrenaline and guilt. And there, buried under an old heating pad, was a small wooden box, no lock, no key, just a box like the kind you'd put keepsakes in if you were sentimental and quiet and scared of being erased. Inside was a folded letter, a necklace I remembered from a photo of her in her 20s, and a single piece of paper with a list, handwritten in her perfect slanted script, the kind they don't teach in schools anymore. The letter was short, not a farewell, not a dramatic monologue, just a few lines. She wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say everything. So I left what mattered most, the truth, as much as I could carry. Forgive me for not saying it sooner." Then the list. 15 lines, some cryptic, some brutally clear. One said, "He wasn't alone in Baltimore." Another said, "Rachel's trust was used for the mortgage. Ask Tom." And the one that hit me hardest, "I wish I had left, but I didn't want her to think love was disposable." I sat there on the floor of that closet for what felt like hours, the box in my lap, the list in my shaking hands, my mother's voice reading each line in my head, like a confession whispered across time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to go to his office and throw it in his face, but I didn't, not yet, because for the first time, I had something he didn't know I had, and that meant power. I didn't tell Eric. I didn't tell anyone. I kept it buried in my own closet, next to the engagement ring I took off every night before bed, not because I didn't love Eric, but because I didn't know how to carry love and fury at the same time without breaking under the weight. That's when I started planning. Not revenge, not exactly. Something quieter, something smarter. The kind of justice that doesn't scream. It whispers and waits and watches. And that velvet box I carried to the dinner, it wasn't just a gesture. It was the first domino. Because what my father didn't know was that I had finally seen my mother, not as a fragile woman who couldn't fight back, but as someone who left behind a weapon in disguise. And I planned to use it with the precision of someone who had been training her whole life to be underestimated. It's a strange thing, the way one single piece of paper, folded, stained slightly at the corners, creased from years of being hidden away in the dark, can carry more weight than all the words ever shouted in an argument, more truth than any family photo ever hung neatly on the living room wall, pretending to tell a story that never really happened. The list my mother left behind wasn't just a note. It wasn't just some dying woman's regrets written in cursive. It was a map. Not the kind that leads you to buried treasure or freedom, but the kind that makes you look back over the terrain of your entire life and realize you've been walking in circles, manipulated and blindfolded, while the person guiding you claimed they were doing it for your own good. I read that list again and again, not just for what it said, but for what it implied, for the gaps between the words where my mother's voice used to exist. It was obvious that some of what she wrote she couldn't say outright. Whether it was fear, guilt, or just lack of time, I'll never know. But she gave me breadcrumbs, and once I started following them, the path led places I never imagined. Places that made me question not only the man I called my father, but also the woman I thought I was. The choices I'd made, and whether I had ever truly been free from his influence. The line that kept echoing in my head, the one I couldn't let go of, was simple but devastating. He wasn't alone in Baltimore. I knew exactly what she meant because Baltimore was where he used to travel for business every other month when I was in high school, always coming back with some meaningless souvenir and a short fuse, snapping at the slightest thing before disappearing into his study for hours. Back then, I believed him. Of course I did. I was 15. I didn't even know what I was supposed to question. But that line, written in her careful handwriting, suddenly made every moment from that time fall into a new frame, one built not of loyalty, but of betrayal, gaslighting, and quiet survival. I started with what I knew: dates, hotel names he'd dropped casually, credit card charges I remembered seeing once when he asked me to help him with his taxes. And because the universe occasionally gives you what you need if you're patient long enough, I found something, a name, a woman, Denise, an insurance sales rep from Towson who apparently had no idea he was married when I reached out, and who sounded just as exhausted as I felt when she realized who I was. She didn't hang up, she didn't lie. She told me what I needed to know, that they'd seen each other for almost 5 years, on and off, that he talked about a complicated situation at home, and that he'd stopped coming around not long before my mother died. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just thanked her, hung up, and sat there staring at the name scribbled on the notepad next to my computer, the weight of it all settling in like wet cement. Because this wasn't just a man who was emotionally distant or hard to please. This was someone who built an entire false version of our family. One where he was the misunderstood patriarch, the provider burdened with an ungrateful daughter and a fragile wife, while secretly betraying the one person who had spent her entire adult life defending his silence, tolerating his moods, and covering his messes. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The second line on the list that broke me was the one that read, "Rachel's trust was used for the mortgage. Ask Tom." I didn't even know I had a trust, let alone one that had been drained to pay for the house I thought was a family legacy, built on love and hard work. Tom, it turns out, was my father's old business partner, a man I remembered only vaguely from barbecues and Christmas parties where he'd get too drunk and laugh too loud. I found him through a mutual connection, and when I asked him point blank whether he knew anything about my trust being used for the house, he didn't lie. He sighed, he sounded tired, maybe even ashamed, and he told me yes, that my mother had set aside money for me when I was born, a substantial amount from her parents' estate, and that after the dot-com crash, my father had taken it, borrowed it, Tom said, to protect the house when their company went under. No one ever paid it back. No one ever told me. And somehow, I was still supposed to believe this man deserved a seat at my engagement dinner, still expected to honor him, to let him make jokes at my expense, to smile and nod like his approval mattered. So I made a list of my own, not of regrets, but of facts. Names, dates, amounts, and lines from my mother's list that I could now verify. It became a kind of scripture for me, a record of everything he thought he buried, everything he assumed no one would ever uncover. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it. Not exactly, but I knew this much. I wasn't going to let him sit at the head of any more tables and pretend he hadn't burned down half the lives around him just to keep his image clean. And that's when I realized that the box I'd placed in front of him at the engagement dinner wasn't just a symbol, and it wasn't just a revoked gift. It was bait. Because what I didn't tell you yet is that inside that box wasn't just a money clip or a note. No, it was a flash drive. Small, silver, discreet. And on it was everything. Copies of the letter from my mother, scans of the list, records of the trust transfer, hotel receipts, even a screenshot of the call log with Denise. I didn't tell him what it was. I didn't need to. I just watched him look at it like he'd found a ticking bomb and had no idea whether it would detonate or just hum softly forever, reminding him of what he could no longer control. Because I wasn't going to scream or fight or plead. I wasn't going to beg him for decency. I was going to take back the narrative, quietly, methodically, and with a precision he never thought I had. And the best part? He still didn't know what I had planned next. There's a moment, a very specific kind of moment, that happens when someone who's always held the power starts to feel it slip. Not all at once like a sudden drop or a crashing wave, but gradually like sand trickling through their fingers while they scramble to pretend they're still holding something solid. That's what I was aiming for. Not to destroy him publicly in some screaming spectacle that would only make me look bitter or unstable, which is exactly the narrative he always leaned on when I dared to challenge him growing up, but to unspool his sense of invincibility thread by thread, the same way he'd slowly unraveled the self-worth of the people around him, one calculated comment at a time, until they were left doubting whether what they felt was even real. In the weeks after the engagement dinner, I didn't reach out to him, didn't return his calls, didn't respond to the mildly condescending email he sent that began with, "I think things got a little overblown," and ended with, "Let's not let emotions ruin a good family evening." I wasn't surprised. He had always been better at pretending things didn't happen than he was at owning up to them, and it was clear he assumed I'd either come crawling back with an apology or at the very least pretend to move on for the sake of peace, the way my mother always had, the way so many women in our family were conditioned to do. But I had no interest in peace that came at the cost of silence. What I wanted, and what I planned with a kind of cold clarity I didn't know I was capable of, was consequence. The thing about a man like my father, someone who spent his whole life curating a reputation that mattered more to him than his own blood, is that you don't go after his heart, you go after his image. You don't yell, you don't threaten, you don't confront him in public unless you want him to spin it into another one of his stories about his difficult daughter, who was always a little emotional. You go where it hurts, the boardrooms, the country clubs, the golf course charity fundraisers, where everyone wears pastel and pretends ethics are optional if your name is engraved on the building's donor wall. And that's where the flash drive came in. It wasn't just filled with my mother's list or old hotel records or scanned letters. By that point, I'd compiled so much more. I found documentation that the trust my mother created for me had been bled dry through a series of emergency transactions filed under the name of a shell company, one that technically no longer existed but was still traceable if you knew where to look. I traced funds that were supposed to be earmarked for a scholarship donation, diverted to pay off a secondary mortgage on a condo I hadn't known he owned in Naples. I pulled emails, statements, a trail of paper thin enough for most people to ignore, unless, of course, you sent it to someone whose job depended on appearances, fiscal compliance, and the illusion of integrity. The email I sent didn't come from my account, of course. That would have been reckless and obvious. Instead, I created a dummy email address, one that couldn't be traced back to me directly. And I wrote a message to the Internal Affairs Committee at his golf club, where he'd served on the finance board for the better part of 8 years and where, every Sunday, he bragged about being the one who kept the books clean and the money honest. I attached everything, every file, every line of documentation, labeled clearly and organized with painful precision, and I added one simple sentence to the body of the email. You might want to take a second look at your treasurer's history with donor funds. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I got a call from my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, who never involved herself in family drama unless it threatened to spill into her curated suburban life. She didn't ask directly, but her voice had that strange tightness to it, like she already knew what I'd done and couldn't decide whether to be horrified or impressed. There's some noise going around, she said, careful as ever. About your father, some kind of audit. People are asking questions. I didn't confirm or deny, I just said, sometimes people should be asked questions. I started hearing whispers after that. Not from him, because he still hadn't called, probably unsure whether to accuse me or ignore me, waiting to see which way the wind blew, but from family friends, from old colleagues who suddenly stopped liking his posts online, from mutual acquaintances who reached out to me with curiosity laced in concern. And I played it exactly right. Calm, measured, unavailable, because power isn't just in what you do, it's in how well you make people believe you're not afraid of consequences. Eric noticed the shift too. At first, he thought I was just stressed from the wedding, but I told him bits and pieces. Not everything, not yet. Just enough for him to understand that there were reasons I wasn't ready to do the whole father of the bride charade. And to his credit, he didn't push. He just said, whatever you need to do, I'm here. And that, more than anything, reminded me that love doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet permission to burn your bridges when they've never led you anywhere safe. The moment that made it all real, that made me feel for the first time like I was standing on solid ground, came at my bridal shower, of all places, where champagne flowed too freely and people gave toasters like they were golden artifacts. My Aunt Carol pulled me aside just before the speeches, and in that same stiff tone she always used when pretending she wasn't deeply uncomfortable, asked, Rachel, this mess with your father, you didn't have anything to do with it, did you? I looked her right in the eye, the way I had looked at him that night at the restaurant, and I said, with a smile that felt more real than anything I'd worn in years. I just gave him a gift. He chose what to do with it. And that's the thing. He did. He opened the box, even if only in his mind. And what he found wasn't kindness, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't even rage. What he found was the reflection of a man who finally had to look at himself and see what everyone else had been too afraid to name. A fraud dressed in respectability, a coward hiding behind tradition. A man undone not by anger, but by the truth he thought he had buried too deep to be found. But I found it, I held it, and I wasn't done, not yet. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but rather like the moment before a storm breaks. Heavy, thick, swollen with the weight of words left unsaid, and consequences waiting just outside the frame of your carefully arranged life. And that's exactly what I felt when I finally stood once again in front of the man who used to terrify me without ever raising his voice. It had been almost 2 months since the engagement dinner, since the velvet box incident, since I'd let him sit in the wreckage of his own making without offering a single rope to pull himself out. And in that time, the world had turned against him in small, calculated ways. Committees disbanded, calls unanswered, invitations lost in the mail, and all of it coated in a film of polite confusion, as though no one wanted to admit what they knew but could no longer ignore. I didn't plan on seeing him before the wedding, didn't think it was necessary, didn't believe there was anything left to say, but something inside me, something buried so deep, I couldn't tell if it was compassion or just the final shred of unfinished business, whispered that I needed to close the circle, to look him in the eye one last time, and give him the thing he had refused to give me my entire life. The truth, unvarnished, unsoftened, uninterested in his comfort. His house looked smaller than I remembered, though nothing had changed. The same porch swing with its tired cushions, the same cracked paint around the windows, the same overwatered hydrangeas that my mother used to trim like they were part of her identity. All of it just as it was, yet shrunken somehow, like the illusion had collapsed and left only a replica behind. He opened the door without surprise, as if he had known this day would come eventually, though his eyes betrayed something else, not fear, not guilt, not even anger, but the hollow look of a man who had finally realized he was no longer the protagonist in anyone's story, but his own. And even that was starting to blur. We didn't sit, we didn't hug. There was no pretense of warmth. I walked past him into the study, where the air always smelled like old paper and masculine arrogance, and I placed the ball, the same one from the dinner, the one he never dared open, onto the center of the desk that used to be off limits to me as a child. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me like a man waiting for a sentence, too proud to beg but too shaken to look away. For a moment, I thought about walking out without saying a word, letting the silence speak on my behalf the way his had so often spoken for him. But then I remembered every time he looked through me like I was an inconvenient mirror, and I knew that if I left now, I'd be no better than he was, passive, distant, terrified of the mess beneath the surface. So I stayed. I opened the box slowly, deliberately, and removed the single item that remained. A small USB drive, silver and unremarkable, but heavy with history. "I don't need you to say anything," I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. "Because there's nothing left you could say that would matter. But I want you to know that I know. About Baltimore, about the trust, about what Mom left me, about everything." His hands, once steady, always folded neatly in his lap, like a politician rehearsing his next justification, now trembled slightly as he reached for the drive, but he didn't pick it up. He just stared at it like it was something foreign, like it might bite him if he touched it. I watched him for a long moment, wondering what he was seeing. Was it my mother's handwriting in his mind? Was it the list she had written, the one he thought would stay buried with her? Or was he seeing something deeper, something he'd kept locked away even from himself? The realization that his daughter had become the one thing he could no longer control. I didn't need to tell him what was on it. He already knew, or at least he feared enough of it to fill in the gaps. But for good measure, I laid it out plainly. Everything's on there. The documents, the letters, the transfers, your history, my mother's voice, the parts of our family you tried to rewrite. You can delete it if you want. You can burn it, deny it, pretend it never existed. That's your right. But just know this. It won't change what I know. It won't change what's already happened. Still, he said nothing. No defense, no apology, no anger. Just the slow, humiliating erosion of the man who once believed he held the universe in the curve of his tongue. I could have stayed longer. I could have dragged the conversation into the light, demanded explanations or apologies, but I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need his sorrow or his guilt or his understanding, because I had finally built something stronger than his silence. I had built truth, and more importantly, I had chosen not to be silent myself. As I walked to the door, I paused, one hand on the frame, and said quietly without turning around, "She loved you, you know, even when she knew what you were, and I think that's what broke her." He didn't reply, but I heard his breath hitch. Not a sob, not a cry, just a crack in the mask he'd worn so tightly for so long. The sun was warm on my skin as I stepped outside, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying a weight that wasn't mine to bear. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean. And maybe that's all I ever wanted. Not revenge, not punishment, just a life without the shadow of his voice trailing behind every choice I made. The wedding happened. It was small, beautiful, honest. Eric stood beside me like an anchor, not a savior. And when the officiant asked if anyone had objections, no one stood, no one spoke, no one even shifted in their seat, because they all knew this was not a woman to interrupt anymore. Still, even now, sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels softer than it used to, I find myself thinking about that box, about how it started as a gift, then became a symbol, then a weapon, and finally, perhaps, a mirror. A reflection not of who my father was, but of who I refused to become. And if you ask me now whether it was worth it, whether all the planning and digging and exposing gave me what I truly wanted, I wouldn't be able to answer with certainty. Because peace, real peace, isn't always loud or clean or simple. Sometimes it's just the absence of needing to be understood. Sometimes it's the decision to stop bleeding for someone who never learned how to bandage wounds they created. I got my truth. I got my voice back. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. But if you're still wondering what was really inside the box, here's the truth. It wasn't the USB. It wasn't the proof. It wasn't even the silence that followed. It was choice. And this time, it was mine.